Hey, welcome to Crime Time 911. Whenever we talk about true crime, it's so easy to get caught up in the twists and turns of the investigation, the courtroom drama, the how did they finally catch him part. But before we go anywhere near that, I want to sit with the person at the center of this story because Renee Sweeney wasn't a headline. She wasn't a case file. She was a young woman with a life, with dreams, with people who loved her. Renee was 23 years old in January of 1998. Think about that for just a second. 23. That age where you're just starting to figure out who you are, where you're going, and what you want your life to look like. You're old enough to have some independence, but young enough that the future still feels wide open. That's where Renee was. She was a student at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. If you've ever been to Sudbury, you know it's a city with a very particular character. It's northern, it's rugged, it's got this mix of mining town grit and university town energy. In the winter, it's cold, snowy, and the kind of place where you bundle up and walk fast to get to where you're going. But it's also a place where people know each other, where community matters. Renee was studying music, and that tells you something right away, doesn't it? Music students are a special breed. They're disciplined because you don't get through hours of practice without discipline. But they're also creative, expressive, and usually deeply connected to the people around them. Friends described her as vibrant, kind, and full of life. She had this energy that drew people in. And like so many students, she was working part-time to help support herself. Her job was at a video store on Paris Street. Now, if you're old enough to remember the 90s, you know what a video store meant back then. This was before streaming, before Netflix, before everything was on demand. If you wanted to watch a movie, you went to the video store. You browsed the shelves, you picked up VHS tapes. You chatted with the person behind the counter about what was good. It was a social hub as much as it was a business. So picture Renee there. She's behind the counter, maybe recommending a movie to a customer, maybe chatting with a regular. It's a normal job, but it's also a place where she connected with people. Her friends and family remembered her as someone who was always smiling, always ready to help, always present. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention. She was just genuinely kind. And that's part of why her story hit Sudbury so hard. Because when you lose someone like that, it feels like the whole community loses a little bit of its light. Let's set the scene a little more. Sudbury in the late 90s was a city in transition. The mining industry was still central, but the university and the hospital were big parts of the community too. Paris Street, where Renee worked, was one of the main arteries of the city. People drove it every day, passing by the video store without a second thought. It was the kind of city where people knew each other, not in the sense that everyone was best friends, but in the sense that faces were familiar. You'd see the same people at the grocery store, at the rink, at the coffee shop. And when something happened to one of those familiar faces, it rippled out fast. That's what happened with Renee. When the news broke, it wasn't just a story on the radio. It was personal. People said, I knew her, or I saw her at the store last week, or she was in my class. It was close. Renee's world was one of music, friends, family, and the everyday routines of a young adult. She was balancing school and work, figuring out her path, and enjoying the independence that comes with being in your early 20s. She wasn't famous. She wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. She was just living her life, like so many of us do at that age. And that's part of why her story resonates, because it could have been anyone. She could have been your friend, your classmate, your coworker. And that's why when we talk about what happened to her, we have to start here with who she was, with the life she was living, with the people who loved her. In the days leading up to January 27th, 1998, Renee's life was normal. She was going to classes, working her shifts at the video store, spending time with friends. There was nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at what was coming. And that's the thing about stories like this. They don't come with a warning sign. They don't announce themselves. They just happen, and suddenly everything is different. For Renee, January 27th started like any other day. She went to work at the video store. She probably expected it to be a quiet shift, maybe a few customers coming in to rent movies, maybe some time to catch up on schoolwork between customers. Just an ordinary day until it wasn't. And that's where we're going to pause for now, because the next part of this story is about what happened that day and how it changed everything. It's about the immediate aftermath, the investigation, and the decades-long search for answers. But before we go there, I want you to hold on to this picture of Renee, a 23-year-old music student working at a video store, living her life in Sudbury, because that's who she was, and that's who the story is really about. So picture this. It's January 27, 1998, a Tuesday. In Sudbury, that means snow on the ground, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air, and people moving quickly from cars to buildings, heads down, shoulders hunched. It's the middle of wintertime, and everyone's just trying to get through the day. For Renee, it was a work day. She was scheduled for a shift at the video store on Paris Street. Nothing unusual about that. She worked there plenty of times before. It was a small, familiar place, the kind of store where regulars came in so often that you knew their names. She probably expected it to be a quiet morning, maybe a few customers stopping in, maybe some time to tidy up shelves or flip through her school notes between rentals. Just another day. But that morning didn't unfold the way anyone expected. Sometime mid-morning, something happened inside that store that would change everything. Customers who came by later described a scene that didn't make sense. Witnesses outside reported seeing a young man running from the store, moving fast, like he didn't want to be seen. Not long after, police were called. Officers arrived quickly, securing the area. They found Renee inside, and it was immediately clear that something terrible had happened. Outside, not far from the store, they found a jacket and gloves discarded in the snow. They looked out of place, like someone had thrown them off in a hurry. Investigators collected them, bagged them, and logged them as evidence. The news spread fast. By that afternoon, Sudbury was buzzing. Radio stations were reporting it. People were calling each other saying, "Did you hear what happened at the video store?" It wasn't just another story. It was shocking because it was Renee. She wasn't a stranger. She was a student, a daughter, a friend. People knew her face. They'd seen her at the store, at school, around town. And now, suddenly, she was gone. The police response was massive. Officers canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything. They interviewed people who had been driving by, people who had been in nearby businesses, anyone who might have noticed something unusual. They collected fingerprints, fibers, and other physical evidence from the store. They documented everything carefully, knowing that even the smallest detail might matter later. Witnesses described the person they saw running from the store as a young man, late teens, maybe early 20s. He was moving quickly, heading away from the scene. The jacket and gloves found nearby seemed to match what people had seen him wearing. But here's the thing. A description like that only goes so far. Young man, late teens, early 20s could describe half the guys in Sudbury at the time. Without a name, without something concrete, it was like chasing smoke. For the people of Sudbury, the shock turned into fear. It wasn't a big city where crime felt distant. It was home. Paris Street was a main road, a place people drove by every day. The idea that something like this could happen there in broad daylight was terrifying. Parents worried about their kids. Students at Laurentian whispered about it in hallways. Customers who had been in the video store before thought, that could have been me. And then there was the grief. Renee's family, her friends, her classmates, they were all devastated. The city mourned with them. Vigils were held. Flowers were left outside the store. People wanted to do something, anything, to show that Renee mattered, that she wouldn't be forgotten. From day one, the investigation was intense. The Sudbury Police Service threw everything they had at it. Detectives worked long hours, following up on every lead. They sent the jacket and gloves to the lab for testing. They compared fingerprints. They tracked down anyone who might have been in the area that morning. But despite all that effort, the case didn't break open. Leads fizzled, tips didn't pan out, the suspect seemed to have vanished. And that's when the case began its long journey into becoming a cold case. For Renee's family, those first weeks were unbearable. They had lost someone they loved, and on top of that, they had no answers. For the community, it was a wound that didn't heal. Every time people drove past the video store, they thought of her. Every time the anniversary came around, the store was back in the news. And for the police, it was a case that weighed heavily. They had evidence, they had witnesses, but they didn't have a name, and without a name, they couldn't move forward. The years after 1998 were some of the hardest for everyone connected to Renee's story. For her family, there was the daily ache of loss, compounded with the fact that there was no answers. For the community, it was like a wound that never healed. Every January, the anniversary came around, and with it came the same questions. Would this be the year something finally broke open? Would this be the year they learned who was responsible? The Sudbury police never closed the file. It stayed active, even as detectives came and went. Some retired, others were reassigned, but the case itself remained on the books. Officers would revisit the evidence, re-interview witnesses, and follow up on tips that trickled in. And through it all, the jacket and gloves found near the store remained central. They were carefully preserved, stored in conditions that would protect them, because investigators knew that one day science might be able to tell them more than it could in 1998. And that's the thing about cold cases. They're not really cold in the sense of being forgotten. They're more like embers, glowing quietly, waiting for the right spark. In this case, that spark came from advances in forensic science. By 2010, DNA testing had become far more precise and reliable than it had been in the late 90s. Databases had expanded, and the ability to cross-reference samples was stronger than ever. Investigators decided to retest the evidence collected from the scene, and this time, they got a match. The DNA pointed to someone who had been just 18 years old at the time of the incident, a man named Joseph Stephen Wright. The news of his arrest in December 2018 hit Sudbury like a thunderclap. After more than 20 years of waiting, there was finally a name. And it wasn't the name of a stranger from far away. It was someone who had been living in Sudbury all along. Wright had gone to high school at Lockerberry Composite, just a short walk from the video store where Renee had worked. After 1998, he had gone on with his life. He attended university, worked in healthcare, and built a career. For 2 decades, he lived quietly while the case remained unsolved. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. The arrest was a shock. People who had gone to school with Wright were stunned. Neighbors who had known him as an adult couldn't believe it. For Renee's family, it was a moment of complicated emotions. Relief that there was finally a name, finally a person to hold accountable, but also grief because no matter what happened next, it wouldn't bring Renee back. The trial began in February 2023, 25 years after Renee's death. It was one of the most closely watched trials in Sudbury's history. The courtroom was packed every day with family members, journalists, and community members who had carried the story in their hearts for decades. The Crown laid out its case carefully. They walked the jury through the timeline of January 27, 1998. They presented the evidence collected at the scene. They explained the DNA analysis that linked Wright to the discarded jacket and gloves. Witnesses testified about seeing a young man fleeing the store that morning. Police officers described the painstaking investigation, the years of work, and the moment in 2018 when Wright was finally arrested. The defense pushed back, arguing that the evidence wasn't conclusive, that there were other possible explanations. They pointed to the fact that Wright had lived an ordinary life for decades, suggesting that the Crown's case relied too heavily on DNA without enough context. But the jury listened closely. They heard the forensic experts who explained how the DNA was tested, retested, and confirmed. They heard from officers who carried the case for years, who spoke about the persistence it took to keep going when answers seemed so far away. They heard from the community members who remembered the day in 1998 when everything changed. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged. On one side sat Renee's family and supporters who had waited 25 years for this moment. On the other side sat Wright's family, stunned that someone they loved was now at the center of such a case. Every day was heavy with emotion, every testimony a reminder of the weight of the past. After 5 weeks of testimony and just over a day of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of second degree. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. On Renee's family's side, there were tears, hugs, and cries of relief. People said, finally, Renee got justice. On Wright's side, there was silence. Wright himself sat still, dressed neatly, listening as the words were read. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. His lawyers quickly announced plans to appeal, but for Renee's family and the Sudbury community, the verdict was a long-awaited moment of accountability. So what do we make of this story? First, it's about persistence. The Sudbury police never gave up. They preserved the evidence, they revisited the case, and when science caught up, they were ready. Second, it's about the community. For 25 years, Sudbury carried Renee's name. They marked anniversaries, they told her story, they refused to let her be forgotten. And finally, it's about remembering the person at the center of it all. Renee wasn't just a case. She was a 23-year-old music student, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had a life and she mattered. So that's the story of the Renee Sweeney case, the cold case that haunted Sudbury for 25 years and the eventual trial that brought resolution. It's a story of loss, persistence, and community. It's a reminder that even when answers take decades, they can still come. Don't forget to follow, like, and share. It helps more people discover these stories and keeps the conversation going. Thanks for listening to Crime Time 911. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember to always trust your gut.